Good evening, everyone. It is really just such a pleasure to welcome this big crowd to see this big man. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Joanne. By the way, Joanne arranged many of the logistics for the evening. We want to thank her for that. So this is our evening with Harry Rosenfeld, and tonight's event is presented by our Center for Communication and Interactive Media in collaboration with the Times Union and the Hearst Corporation. So thank you very much to the Hearst Corporation. Literally by popular demand, tonight's format will not be a lecture, but an interview conducted by Rex Smith. Mr. Smith is editor and vice president of the Times Union and host of a nationally syndicated weekly program, The Media Project, on Northeast Public Radio. Formerly, Rex was a national correspondent, bureau chief for Newsday, Washington congressional aide, television reporter, and Metro New York television anchor. So thank you for being the interviewer tonight, Rex. And as Rex said, tonight is not his night, but Harry Rosenfeld's night. So it's an honor and a pleasure to have Harry Rosenfeld, who will discuss his new book, From Kristallnacht to Watergate, Memoirs of a Newspaperman. Mr. Rosenfeld's career, many of you in the audience know, spanned 5 decades and gave him a place as a really iconic figure in American journalism. Currently, he's editor-at-large, an editorial board member, and consultant to the Times Union in Albany. But previously, Mr. Rosenfeld was editor of both the Knickerbocker News until it closed in 1988 and the Times Union. Before arriving in Albany in 1978 to join the Times Union, Mr. Rosenfeld was an editor at the New York Herald Tribune, at which time in 1960 he became a foreign editor. But he served perhaps most famously to many of us in the audience during the 1970s as a Metro editor of the Washington Post. And during that period, he supervised the well-known reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, in the historic Watergate investigation that kept me, the nation, and the world entranced, and led eventually to the resignation and scandal of President Richard Nixon. That work earned the Post a Pulitzer Gold Medal for public service. And of course, we can all see the movie version again, All the President's Men, with Jack Warden in the role of Harry Rosenfeld. Paul Grandal, our friend and reporter for the Times Union, is in the audience, and he describes himself as an editor on the margins of Mr. Rosenfeld's book. He quoted Alan Miller, who described Harry Rosenfeld as a bulldog in a bow tie. But Paul himself has a different animal in mind. He wondered whether Harry was grizzly bear or teddy bear. Either way, Harry Rosenfeld's reputation as a first-rate, tough newspaperman was well-earned. Locally, he oversaw award-winning coverage as editor of our big stories about dark and dirty politics, the descent to prison of Jim Coyne, Albany County executive for bribery and dishonest politics, and operations behind Albany's O'Connell-Corning Democratic machine. Tonight, we're going to learn together about a very fascinating life and a very fascinating career of Harry Rosenfeld. So please join me in welcoming the guy who made them get it right, Mr. Harry Rosenfeld.
Standing room only, Harry. This is quite something.
Yes, it is.
Last week, Harry was speaking to the Society of Silurians in Manhattan, an organization of journalists, and they had the largest luncheon attendance they've ever had. So I think there is some significant interest in this book, and those of you who might have read it already will understand that. It's a fascinating book and gives us some insight into not only Harry's career, but the trajectory of journalism over the last half century. So we'll explore a little bit of that tonight, hopefully, if Harry gives the answers that I want him to, we'll see. We have ways in this business of getting answers out of people, In any case, I'd like to start, before we go through chronologically, I think it'd be a good idea for you to know a little bit about Harry. And I have just a couple little incidents that I'd like to bring out from the middle of the book. I want to start with this one, Harry. At the New York Herald Tribune, which for those of you who don't remember, well, I wasn't around at the time, but it had the legendary reputation of being the great newspaper that financially couldn't survive in the city. But at the New York Herald Tribune, where you were first, I think, night foreign editor, and then you became the foreign editor, you had a particular way of signing a cable to your core of foreign correspondents, stringers and staff, and it created some controversy. I think it's instructive to tell us about that.
The thing to remember in answering your question is that the Herald Tribune, and all the time that I worked for it, which began when I graduated from high school in 1948, was that it was a struggling paper. It was always struggling. It could not find its market, and so things were always very, very tight at the Herald Tribune. After many years at working at menial jobs, I finally did accede to some sort of status as the foreign editor, the cable editor. And I would sign my cables to my correspondents, the few of them that we had, with a sign-off of regards, Rosenfeld. I thought that was just a decent thing to do. But the bean counters, who were very important at the Herald Tribune for the reasons that I've stated, I thought that was a terrible waste of money because that one word cost money, and if you sent enough cables, it cost by their lights a lot of money. But I insisted, I ignored their criticisms, and I always signed my cables regards Rosenfeld, to the point where the foreign correspondents, instead of calling me Harry Rosenfeld, called me regards Rosenfeld.
Well, I think it's just a nice bit of courtesy that you extended to the people out in the front line, some distance away from the home office.
Especially the cable that originates in New York at, say, 9 p.m., arrives in London at about 2:30 a.m., and even if the correspondent in the family understands, however resentfully, the spouse of that person does not understand. Very, very unreasonable.
We'll have more to say later about long-suffering spouses. Anyway, at the Washington Post, where you went in 1966, just to continue on a little bit of background here, you arrived there first as a night foreign editor, and you write that the newsroom was filled with, quote, solemn editors overdosing on their own presumed gravitas. And there was some warning from some quarters that you might not fit in there. Would you like to describe that?
Well, for one thing, my spouse of some duration at that point suggested that I tame down my personality for Washington. And in New York, we were kind of an exuberant band. We were fighting a losing battle, but we were fighting it with fervor and with energy and with creativity. We knew we were in a battle, and it showed in the way we reacted to each other. We didn't take each other seriously, but we respected each other. At the Washington Post, the work quality when I arrived there was not terribly high. It was a mediocre paper. And Ben Bradley, under the direction of Catherine Graham, his whole purpose was to make it a first-class paper. And he hired many people in those years, and I was one of them, who were intended to take this sort of schlep-along paper and make something of it. And there was a great deal of resentment because people were entrenched in their work habits, which weren't very strong. And they thought they just were here for another day's work. And if there's a little bit less done today than they did yesterday, so what, you know? And here it comes infused these Huns with a different attitude. And we started to say, well, there are standards, and you have to do this, and you have to tell us who your sources are, and who's the mysterious person that is the focal point of your story, who's not identified. At least tell us, even if we don't tell the reader. Well, there was great indignation over this, you know. We were stepping on their turf. So it was really quite a battle to get people to come on board. I'm happy to say that most of them did come on board, and most of them were able to succeed in the new atmosphere that then came to prevail at the Washington Post.
It took a few years.
It did indeed.
First on the foreign desk, and
Yes,
then
the foreign desk was comparatively easy, although at the time it did not seem easy. And there were many battles and many resentments, and I was described as a hard ass who nobody in the field respected, and I just made up my mind. I wasn't in a popularity contest. That was not what I was hired for. I knew what I was hired for. Foisey, the foreign editor, my boss, knew what we were doing. He outlined the battle plan, and I executed it. And we just went on and we did it. And by time, more or less, they either came to our way of thinking or they departed for other opportunities.
nicely put. It wasn't all Harry the hard ass, as you said. Here, these words from the William Goldman, novelist and screenwriter, who was the screenwriter for the movie All the President's Men. He had visited the afternoon news meeting at the Washington Post while doing his research for writing the screenplay. And he wrote this: "Afterward, the top editors came up and told me that they weren't as funny as they usually are because one of the editors, Harry Rosenfeld, the part played by Jack Warden in the movie, was out that day. The next day, Rosenfeld was back and was, as advertised, hysterical. In these meetings with various editors, Metropolitan, National, Foreign, all of them argue with each other about the importance of their stories and the prominence their stories should receive. And every time one of these guys would tout a story, Rosenfeld would zap him. Funny, funny jokes. And sitting in the corner of the room, I copied down Rosenfeld's lines in my notebook, and in my screenplay, when I wrote the budget meeting scenes, I used Rosenfeld's lines." So apparently you managed to bring some humor to this enterprise as well.
Well, that's what, when we spoke earlier about the overweight of the gravitas on that, they were so solemn about everything when there was a good opportunity for joshing each other, for pushing each other, for maneuvering each other. And most of my entrenched colleagues, the ones that were resident when I arrived, resented that. They were not used to that. They were, they were very serious about themselves, and they weren't so serious about their work product, but they're very serious about themselves.
Well, let's take a step back. Instead of, I want to go back to the sort of the beginning of the chronology here anyway, and talk a little bit about your childhood. You were the son of Polish immigrants, a couple who had been in Germany for about 20 years, who lived in Germany for 20 years by the time they left, right? Your father was a furrier. I gather with some success until things began to be shut down under Hitler. So tell us really in what ways your family life was disrupted by what was going on in Berlin in the couple of years and months leading up to Kristallnacht.
Well, my father came as a young man. He was recruited in 1917, which was World War. Germany occupied Russian Poland during that war, and he was recruited by a fashion house in Berlin, a high fashion house, which was short of men because their workers were in the Imperial German Army. And so he went there and he worked, and he was a very, very good furrier. And in Germany, he became qualified as a master craftsman, and he has a degree that my daughter Susan now possesses. That's really an enormous degree that describes him as a master craftsman. And almost from the first, he was very successful, so that he was able to go into business for himself, and my parents did very, very well. And just after I was born, well, the Nazis were around from right after World War I, but by the time I was born, they were getting more and more active politically and getting a following, and then things gradually became tougher. And they became grim as time went on, to the point where Well, more restrictions were heaped, frankly, on German Jews. Their citizenship was taken away. Their rights to civil service jobs were taken away. Polish Jews didn't have any rights to civil service jobs. And life became constantly more restricted, and to the point of it becoming economically almost impossible. But even during these times, excuse me, I'm battling a fierce bronchitis. My father did good business. He was a very good furrier, and his clientele was throughout the general population. It wasn't restricted to a Jewish clientele, for example. I remember once visiting with my mother when my father already had been deported to the mistress of a very high Wehrmacht general. She was a customer. I remember that incident rather well because she greeted us in a very flimsy negligee. And that day I saw more in female form than I had ever seen before. Anyway, I averted my eyes because I was a very well brought up child.
Absolutely. Very good. You know, I think what I'm going to do also is bring this microphone up just a bit. I think we're hitting on your button here. You hear that little clicking? There we go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. There we go. That should help. So your dad eventually left. Somehow he managed to get out at a time
Well, he
when...
didn't manage to get out. He was seized in the middle of the night by 2 Gestapo officers who knocked on our door and said they were taking him away. They said they couldn't tell us why they were taking him away. They were courteous, and we didn't have any idea. And my mother told my older sister, Raisy, she is 8.5 years my senior, to follow him to the police station, which he did, and there she found a whole mass of men assembled, and she asked the policeman what was going on, and the policeman also said he could not say. But he did suggest to her that she go home, pack a valise for my father with a change of clothing. So she did this quickly and returned, and just as she returned, she saw my father on an open truck that was beginning to move, and she handed him the valise. For 3 days, we did not know where he was. And we did not know if he was in a concentration camp or whatever had happened to him. After 3 days, we got a phone call from him. He was in Warsaw. He was at my mother's elder sister's house, and he was safe. He had also been extraordinarily lucky because he had been placed on one of 3 trains carrying these rounded up Polish nationals who were being deported by the Germans. And those 3 trains were permitted to enter Poland. After that, more trains, many more trains carrying many more Polish Jewish deportees were not let in by the Poles, who didn't want their own Jews. And they were dumped on a no man's land between Germany and Poland. And there, many of them came to a very bad fate, both from the harsh November climate and from hostile action by both Polish and German forces.
He was...
So you can't say he got out of it, you know. So.
He was still gone at the time of Kristallnacht?
He was. Kristallnacht happened about 3 weeks later.
Tell us what you recall of that night.
Of Kristallnacht.
Yes, you were 9?
I was 9. I was 9 when both events happened. And I was 9 when we arrived in America. So it was a very eventful year for me. Mm-hmm. And there came another knock on our door. This time it was in the daytime hours. And the person who came to our door was a man well known to my parents. He was the son of people that my parents were friendly with. The father of the son had been a soldier in the Russian army during World War I. He was captured by the Germans, and he was assigned to do farm work at the woman's farmhouse, the woman's family's farm. They fell in love, and after the war, they married, and they remained in Germany, and they had a family. And my parents were friendly with this young man's parents. The family emigrated to Brazil before we had any chance to leave Germany, but the son remained behind. And his wife worked in the office of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. And because of that position, the son had been able to be useful to my parents over the years. In what ways, I can't begin to tell you. I don't know. But he had never been to our home. He always called from a public phone. This time, he came to our home, ripped the nameplate off our door, and said, "Get dressed, get yourself together, leave everything behind, and rush to the Polish embassy. Bad things were about to happen." We did this. We got to the embassy, and there already the courtyard was jammed with Polish Jews. And there we waited for many hours on this really raw November day. I played tag with kids I recognized among the crowd. And every once in a while we saw truckloads of brown shirts coming by, singing their songs, till the Polish authorities, late at night, told us it was safe to return to our homes. We got home, and we found that both our store and our apartment were untouched. There are lots of reasons, speculative reasons for this, but one of them was that our store on the night was shuttered, but it complicated. Later on, it turned out that the Germans had said, the Nazis had said, leave the foreign Jews alone. Although the first Jew to die on Kristallnacht was a Polish Jew. In general, apparently that was followed. I can't explain to you why our property was not molested. The next morning, I nagged my mother to let me go to the temple where I went to school, since Hitler threw Jews like me out of the public schools in 1937. Now, the Jewish community didn't then permit the kids just to sit around and say, we don't have any school anymore. They set up a school system, which we attended. And I wanted to see what was happening. So I went with a friend, and my mother let me go. I remember, I was 9 years old. And she let me go. I can't explain it, but she did. I wouldn't let my 9-year-old go. And we walked through the glass-shattered streets. All the stuff was being swept up past department stores that had been smashed to pieces. We lived in a very Tony part of town. And we walked to our synagogue, which was the synagogue where I went to school. It was only our synagogue because I went to school there. My parents were not great synagogue goers. And there I saw a mass of people watching as this building, which was really an iconic Jewish building in Germany. It was built at a time early in the 20th century when the Kaiser Wilhelm donated some extraordinary things to it. It was a sign of the achievement of Jews' integration into German life. Very ironically, it was ordered destroyed by Goebbels. And I saw it burn. I saw the flames come through the roof. It was a Moorish dome, sort of. I saw the firemen standing by. They had ample apparatus, but they weren't there to put out the fire. They were there to make sure that no non-Jewish properties would be afflicted. And that was my, and is my, everlasting memory of Kristallnacht.
This convinced your family that you really needed to get out.
We've been trying to get out since 1934, when my parents realized what was happening in Nazi Germany, where in the year or so before Hitler came to power, when they discussed emigrating to America, because my father and my mother both had brothers and sisters and cousins and whatnot in this country for decades. And at that point, my mother said, no, we have a great life in Germany. There's so much culture. We participate in it. And they even bought a plot of land outside of Berlin in which to build a country home. Now, that's not bad for a furrier in Germany in that time. He was doing well. But then, very shortly after Hitler came into power as chancellor, it was evident that those days were gone forever, and they did apply. My father was permitted to come, but he could not bring the family. So he did not want to do that. Wise man. So our application was in there, and periodically, my sister, Razy, who had been educated in the gymnasium and spoke English pretty well, she also spoke French. German education was pretty good. And she went down to the American Embassy continually to see where did we stand, where did we stand. It became the focus of our lives to get that quota number. But we now know what we did not understand in Germany. There were high officials in the State Department who had an ample supply of Polish quota numbers, who didn't want them handed out to Polish Jews. They didn't want them coming to America. They were downright anti-Semites. They've been identified, they've been well known, and they were very high in the State Department. Franklin Roosevelt's State Department.
Eventually, the number comes through.
It comes through in March of 1939. My father is in Poland, but because the numbers now come through, he's permitted to return to Berlin to accompany us to the United States. He comes home, he's depressed, he looks out, stares out the window. This is my sister's telling me, I'm not so aware of his behavior being that way. And it wasn't until we got to England that he really enlivened himself. And shortly after a stay in England with my mother's aunt, who had been resident there for 50 years, something like that, we sailed on the SS Aquitania and arrived on May 16, 1939. That is 107 days before the start of the Second World War.
You went to the Bronx, where you had an uncle.
Yes.
And you were a 9-year-old boy who spoke no English, who really had no experience in America, except I think you told one of your friends confidently that you weren't sure if you were going to see cowboys or not, but you figured, right?
One of my small actions of revenge was to tell tall stories. So as I was departing Berlin, I told my playmates, some of whom were better playmates than others, that my uncle had a ranch in the West, but I wasn't quite sure whether there still were Indians there. And I know I ate their stony little hearts out.
Excellent. So
that's why I became a journalist. I knew how to tell stories. So what if they're a little bit off?